London dawned bleak and cheerless on the morning of April 17th, 1851, grey clouds hanging low over the city like harbingers of sorrow, perfectly mirroring the heaviness in Lady Eleanor Blackwood's heart as she sat motionless at her dressing table, while her lady's maid, Margaret, arranged her chestnut hair with practiced hands. The modest townhouse on Berkeley Square, once the pride of the Blackwood family before financial ruin had forced them to lease most of their properties, felt particularly confining today of all days. Margaret gently remarked that her ladyship had barely touched her breakfast, concern evident in her voice as she secured another pin into the elegant coiffure she was creating, but Eleanor could only manage a wan smile in response, her grey eyes meeting her reflection with resignation. At 26, Lady Eleanor was considered firmly on the shelf by London society, her prospects diminished not only by her age, but by the scandal of her father's gambling debts 3 seasons prior. None of that would have mattered to Eleanor, had her heart not belonged wholly and completely to the one man she could never have, the very man whose wedding she was now preparing to attend with the composed dignity expected of her station. Duke James Westmoreland had been her dearest friend since childhood, their estates having bordered one another in Hampshire, and she had watched him grow from a mischievous boy into the most respected peer of the realm, always at his side through triumph and hardship, always the confidant but never the beloved. The cream-coloured morning dress laid out across her bed seemed to mock her with its careful propriety, selected specifically to help her fade into the background at St. George's Cathedral, where James would pledge his life to 19-year-old Lady Sophia Pembroke, daughter of the Earl of Harrington, and possessor of both flawless beauty and an immense dowry. Eleanor had endured the engagement announcement at Lady Winchester's ball 2 months prior, with a fixed smile that had fooled everyone except Margaret, who had held her through the subsequent tears that night. Now, as Margaret fastened the last button of her dress and arranged a modest hat atop her carefully styled hair, Eleanor gathered her emotional armor around her like the light shawl she draped over her shoulders, preparing to witness the ceremony that would finally extinguish the flame of hope she had nurtured in secret for more than a decade. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the window as the first raindrops began to speckle the glass, nature itself seeming to understand that this day would bring no joy to Eleanor Blackwood, only the culmination of years of silent longing and the final proof that duty would always triumph over the desires of the heart in their world. The approaching storm promised to drench the wedding guests as they travelled to the cathedral, but Eleanor knew that no rain could possibly match the torrent of tears she would have to suppress when the man she loved bound himself forever to another. The memories flooded Eleanor as her carriage rolled toward the cathedral, vivid images of Hampshire summers when she and James ran wild through the meadows separating Westmoreland Hall from Blackwood Manor. How innocent those days had been, when the heir to a dukedom and the daughter of a respected viscount could be simply children together, climbing apple trees, racing ponies across dew-covered fields, and creating elaborate imaginary kingdoms in the ancient woods that belonged to both estates. She recalled with painful clarity the gradual shift in her heart, the summer of her 16th year when James returned from his first term at Oxford, no longer the lanky boy who had pulled her braids, but a young man of commanding presence and thoughtful intelligence. They still spent every available moment together during holidays, but something had changed in the air between them, charged with unspoken awareness that adulthood approached with all its expectations and limitations. It was during those golden afternoons, reading poetry beneath the great oak by the stream that marked the boundary between their lands, that Eleanor had first recognized the flutter in her chest whenever James smiled at her as love, not mere friendship. Throughout the years that followed, as Eleanor made her debut in London society, and James shouldered increasingly heavy responsibilities following his father, the 6th Duke's declining health, their connection had only deepened. James often escaped to the solitude of her company when the weight of his position became too burdensome, confiding that Eleanor alone truly saw him, not merely the title he carried or the fortune he commanded, but the man beneath with all his doubts and dreams. She had treasured those confidences, storing each shared moment like precious jewels in the vault of her memory, never daring to speak of her own feelings, understanding even then the impossibility of their situation. Society expected the Duke of Westmoreland to marry strategically, securing alliances with wealth and impeccable bloodlines, not to follow his heart to the daughter of a neighboring estate, however deep their connection. And then, 3 seasons ago, disaster had struck when Lord Blackwood, Eleanor's father, had lost the family fortune at the gaming tables, necessitating the sale of their beloved manor and a hasty retreat to the modest London townhouse that remained. The scandal had effectively removed Eleanor from the marriage market. Not that she had ever encouraged any suitors, her heart belonging irrevocably to James. Now, at 26, she was considered firmly on the shelf, her prospects diminished by both circumstance and the inexorable passage of time. James, meanwhile, had ascended to the dukedom upon his father's death last winter. The responsibilities of his position increased tenfold, including the expectation that he would soon secure the succession with an advantageous marriage. Lady Sophia Pembroke, with her youth, beauty, and substantial dowry, represented everything society demanded in a duchess, while Eleanor, despite the depth of their connection, represented everything it would reject. The constraints of their world had proven stronger than the bonds of their hearts, a bitter truth that Eleanor had been forced to accept when James had announced his engagement 2 months prior. The Blackwood carriage swayed gently over London cobblestones as the rain intensified, forcing elegant wedding guests to hurry beneath umbrellas toward the grand Westmoreland Cathedral, whose Gothic spires rose imperiously against the darkening sky. Lady Eleanor sat opposite her mother. The once grand Lady Blackwood, now reduced to wearing outdated finery, carefully maintained to preserve the illusion of prosperity, her lined face a study in practiced dignity, despite their diminished circumstances. The Countess leaned forward, adjusting a stray lock of hair that had escaped from beneath Eleanor's hat, reminding her daughter in hushed tones that the Tun would be watching closely today, scrutinizing how she bore this particular trial, and that above all she must remember her dignity. Eleanor nodded obediently, though inwardly she wondered how one maintained dignity while watching one's heart shatter into irretrievable pieces. The rain lashing against the carriage windows seemed to mock her composure, each droplet a reminder of the tears she refused to shed. Her thoughts drifted unbidden to that terrible evening at Lady Winchester's ball, when James had announced his engagement, the moment frozen perfectly in her memory, like an insect trapped in amber. He had stood tall and handsome in his formal attire, making the announcement with the perfect aristocratic composure expected of his station, while Sophia had smiled triumphantly at his side, her 19 years and flawless beauty, a stark contrast to Eleanor's more mature presence. Eleanor had maintained her composed smile throughout the congratulations, the toasts, the endless parade of well-wishers, even managing to offer her own felicitations to the happy couple without betraying the devastation raging within her breast. James had looked at her with an unfathomable expression when she approached, something like regret flickering briefly in his blue eyes before being subsumed by the mask of ducal serenity he had perfected since taking the title. Later, she had overheard 2 matrons discussing how the new duke had finally done his duty, selecting a bride who would bring both beauty and fortune to the ancient Westmoreland line, securing the succession with a young wife likely to provide multiple heirs. Eleanor understood with painful clarity that James, like herself, had been raised to place duty above personal inclination, to sacrifice individual happiness for the greater good of family legacy and societal expectation. The carriage slowed as they approached the cathedral, where a line of black carriages already disgorged members of the highest echelons of society gathered to witness the union of 2 great houses. Through the rain-streaked window, Eleanor caught a glimpse of the cathedral interior, ablaze with hundreds of candles that somehow failed to dispel the growing gloom of the storm outside. Her mother squeezed her gloved hand briefly, perhaps the only acknowledgement she would ever make of understanding her daughter's pain, before arranging her features into the serene mask of social propriety that had become second nature to them both. As a footman opened their carriage door, Eleanor steeled herself for the performance ahead, gathering the fragments of her breaking heart behind a facade of perfect composure, just as James had undoubtedly done when choosing duty over what might have been. Westmoreland Cathedral stood resplendent despite the gloom outside, its vaulted ceilings soaring heavenward above hundreds of aristocratic heads, the ancient stone walls transformed by thousands of white roses and burning tapers that cast a golden glow upon the assembled peerage of England. Crystal chandeliers suspended from ornate chains illuminated the nave where footmen in Westmoreland livery guided guests to their appointed places, the air heavy with expensive perfumes, beeswax, and the subtle rustling of silk as ladies adjusted their finery. Eleanor followed her mother to their seats, positioned respectably near the middle of the cathedral, not close enough to suggest intimate connection with the wedding party, yet not so far back as to imply social insignificance, a careful placement that spoke volumes about their precarious standing in society. From this vantage point, Eleanor had a clear view of the altar, where James stood in silent contemplation, resplendent in his formal attire, the dark blue coat emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight. Even from a distance, she could discern the tension in his stance, the slight rigidity of his aristocratic profile as he conversed briefly with his best man, the Marquess of Halford. Eleanor wondered if anyone else noticed this subtle discomfort, or if her intimate knowledge of his expressions, earned through years of friendship, gave her unique insight into his state of mind. She arranged her features into a serene mask, nodding graciously to acquaintances who glanced her way, pretending not to notice the speculative looks that occasionally darted between herself and the groom. The orchestra, positioned in the cathedral loft, began playing softly, signaling that the ceremony would soon commence, and the assembled guests settled into expectant silence. The music swelled dramatically as the cathedral doors swung wide to admit the bridal procession, a parade of young ladies in pale blue gowns escorting Lady Sophia Pembroke toward her future. The bride appeared like a vision from a fairy tale, her magnificent gown of silver-embroidered ivory silk seeming to float around her slender form, the Richmond family diamonds glittering at her throat and woven through her golden curls, her youth and beauty undeniable in the soft candlelight. Yet, as she processed slowly toward the altar, Eleanor caught the calculating coldness in her blue eyes, the triumph in her perfect smile, revealing that this match represented conquest rather than connection. The contrast struck Eleanor forcefully as she watched James turn to receive his bride, his expression inscrutable as he executed a perfect formal bow. How different his demeanor was now from the uninhibited joy she had witnessed when they rode across Hampshire fields together, or the vulnerable trust when he confided his fears and dreams by firelight at Blackwood Manor. This union before them represented everything society valued: wealth joined to wealth, beauty to position, ancient name to impeccable breeding. Yet Eleanor alone seemed to recognize the absence of the one element that could not be arranged by ambitious families or negotiated in marriage settlements, the genuine understanding that flourished only in the fertile soil of true connection. The ancient words of the marriage service echoed through the cathedral as the Bishop of London intoned each solemn phrase with practiced gravity, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the sacred space, where even the most distant guests could witness the binding of two great houses. When he reached the traditional question asking if any person present knew just cause why the couple should not be joined, a momentary hush fell over the congregation, that perfunctory pause that in 1,000 weddings had never been filled with objection. It was in this breathless silence that Eleanor felt rather than saw James turn slightly, his gaze finding her across the crowded cathedral with unerring accuracy, as though some invisible thread still connected their souls despite everything that stood between them. For a fleeting instant, their eyes met across the sea of fashionable bonnets and top hats, and Eleanor glimpsed something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that might have been regret or longing, or merely a final farewell to their shared past. Whatever its meaning, that brief connection proved her undoing, the last stone that collapsed the dam of her carefully maintained composure. The bishop continued with the ceremony, the moment passing without incident as society expected, but Eleanor found herself suddenly unable to draw sufficient breath, the cathedral walls seeming to press inward, the scent of roses becoming cloying and suffocating rather than sweet. With movements born of desperate necessity rather than conscious decision, She rose silently from her seat while attention remained fixed on the couple at the altar, her mother too engrossed in maintaining her own dignity to notice her daughter's retreat. Eleanor slipped sideways along the pew and toward a small side door half hidden behind a marble column designed for the discreet entry and exit of cathedral staff. No one marked her departure. No whispers followed her progress, the assembled aristocracy too captivated by the spectacle before them to notice one unremarkable gentlewoman making her escape. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with a soft thud that seemed to echo the finality of her loss, admitting her to a small stone courtyard bordered by the cathedral's rose garden. The first drops of rain fell upon her upturned face as she emerged, fat, cold droplets that mingled indistinguishably with the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, her control finally shattered beyond recovery. She made no attempt to seek shelter beneath the cloister walkway that bordered the garden, instead walking blindly forward into the intensifying downpour, welcoming the cleansing chill that soaked through her cream silk gown and penetrated to her very skin. Eleanor Blackwood, who had spent her entire life conforming to the expectations of her position, who had never once given society cause to question her perfect decorum, now stood abandoned to grief in the cathedral garden, her carefully arranged hair collapsing beneath the weight of rain, her face lifted to the weeping heavens in silent communion with their sorrow. Inside, James Westmoreland was binding himself to another woman with sacred vows, while outside, Eleanor finally surrendered to the torrent of emotion she had suppressed for years, her silent sobs matched by the steady rhythm of rain that would soon drench her to the bone. The rain fell in earnest now, transforming from gentle drops to sheets of water that plastered Eleanor's fine cream silk to her body like a second skin, the delicate fabric growing translucent and heavy against her slender frame. She made no move to seek shelter, standing instead with arms slightly outstretched among the rose bushes, whose blooms bent under the weight of the downpour, their sweet fragrance intensified by the rain. Water streamed down her face, indistinguishable from the tears that flowed without restraint, now that she had abandoned all pretense of composure. The elegant coiffure that Margaret had so carefully arranged that morning collapsed entirely, sending pins scattering and allowing her chestnut locks to tumble down her back in sodden waves. Eleanor welcomed the physical discomfort, the chill that penetrated to her bones, the weight of her waterlogged garments, finding in these sensations a fitting, external manifestation of the pain that threatened to consume her from within. Somewhere inside those stone walls, behind stained glass windows that glowed with candlelight despite the stormy gloom, James was speaking sacred vows that would bind him forever to another woman, promises that would sever the last tenuous connection between their souls. With these vows, I lose him forever, she thought, the words repeating in her mind like a terrible litany as she pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle the sobs that now racked her body. 20 years of friendship, 6 years of secret love, countless moments of shared laughter and whispered confidences, all sacrificed on the altar of duty and societal expectation. Her carefully constructed walls of propriety and restraint, maintained through years of watching James from a distance, crumbled completely as she surrendered to the grief she had so long denied. The thunder that rolled overhead seemed to echo the turmoil in her heart, nature itself acknowledging the magnitude of her loss as lightning briefly illuminated the garden in stark relief. Eleanor thought fleetingly of her mother, who would surely be mortified by her disappearance and subsequent disheveled state, of the gossip that might follow when she eventually returned to the cathedral soaked and bedraggled. Yet for once in her meticulously proper life, she found herself utterly unconcerned with appearances or reputation. Let them talk. Let them whisper behind fans about poor Lady Eleanor Blackwood and her unseemly display. Nothing they could say would add to the pain of knowing that James now belonged to another, that the connection she had treasured above all else in her life was severed irrevocably by sacred vows and legal contracts. The cold rain continued its relentless assault, streaming down her neck and between her shoulder blades, plastering the fine lawn of her chemise against her skin beneath her gown, washing away the carefully applied rose water that had scented her skin that morning. She stood with face tilted upward, allowing the downpour to cleanse her as though she might somehow wash away not just the evidence of her tears, but the very love that had sustained and tormented her for so long. Within the candlelit splendor of Westmoreland Cathedral, James stood at the altar beside his bride, his expression a carefully maintained mask of ducal dignity, as he repeated the sacred vows that had bound generations of his ancestors. The ceremony progressed with the stately rhythm expected of such an occasion, each response delivered with appropriate gravity until the moment came for his final pledge, the irrevocable words that would bind him to Lady Sophia for all his days. The bishop looked at him expectantly, the ancient prayer book held open to display the words James had memorized weeks before, yet suddenly his throat constricted, the vow lodged immovably behind lips that refused to part. Something drew his gaze from the altar toward the congregation, an inexplicable awareness pulling his attention to a particular spot in the middle of the cathedral, where Eleanor had been seated beside her mother. The empty space where she should have been struck him with unexpected force, her absence somehow more conspicuous than her presence had been, the vacant seat a silent accusation amid the packed pews. James felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere as the pause extended beyond propriety, the rustling of silks and whispered speculations rippling through the assembled aristocracy. Beside him, Lady Sophia Pembroke, resplendent in her bridal finery, shifted slightly, her voice barely audible as she prompted him with carefully controlled irritation, inquiring if His Grace was aware the bishop awaited his response. The cold calculation in her tone, so different from the warm understanding he had always found in Eleanor's voice, crystallized the doubt that had plagued him since announcing their engagement. With sudden, blinding clarity, James Westmoreland, 7th Duke of Richmond, realized he stood upon the precipice of a terrible mistake, about to pledge his life to a woman chosen for her dowry and bloodline rather than any genuine connection. The thought of Eleanor somewhere beyond those cathedral walls, perhaps even now departing his life forever, struck him with physical pain, as though some vital organ had been suddenly excised from his body. Years of rigid adherence to duty, of sacrificing personal inclination for familial expectation, of denying the deepest yearnings of his heart for the sake of the Westmoreland legacy, seemed abruptly and completely meaningless compared to the prospect of a lifetime without the one woman who truly knew him. The bishop cleared his throat discreetly, attempting to recall the Duke's attention to the matter at hand, but James found himself unable to proceed. The familiar weight of obligation now crushed beneath the greater burden of impending regret. He knew with bone-deep certainty that if he completed these vows, if he bound himself to the woman beside him while Eleanor walked alone in the world, he would spend every remaining day of his life haunted by what might have been. As whispers grew more audible throughout the cathedral, as Lady Sophia stiffened beside him in growing mortification, as the bishop shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, the Duke of Westmoreland made the first truly independent decision of his life, one that would scandalize London society, enrage the Pembroke family, and potentially alter the course of his ducal legacy forever. The murmur of confusion rippling through the cathedral swelled to audible gasps as James Westmoreland, 7th Duke of Richmond, took a deliberate step backward from the altar, his movement so decisive it might have been choreographed. The bishop faltered mid-sentence, prayer book trembling slightly in his aged hands as James turned to face his bride, his expression transformed from aristocratic reserve to resolute certainty. In clear tones that carried to the furthest reaches of the ancient cathedral, he addressed the increasingly horrified Lady Sophia, informing her with unexpected gentleness that he could not proceed with their marriage, knowing his heart belonged elsewhere, that to do so would dishonor them both. Lady Sophia Pembroke, her face flushing crimson beneath her delicate veil, recoiled as though struck, while behind her the assembled wedding party stood frozen in tableau of collective shock. From the front pew, the Countess of Harrington, Lady Sophia's mother, released a strangled cry before collapsing in a cascade of lavender silk and ostrich feathers, attended immediately by fluttering ladies with vinaigrettes and smelling salts. The Duke of Halford, James' paternal uncle and closest living relative, surged forward with remarkable speed for a man of his years, grasping his nephew's arm with fingers that whitened at the knuckles as he hissed urgent warnings about family honor and the catastrophic consequences of such public rejection. James extricated himself with firm resolve, his voice carrying throughout the now buzzing cathedral as he apologized to the assembled guests for the unfortunate spectacle, accepting full responsibility for the broken engagement, while emphasizing that Lady Sophia deserved a husband whose heart was fully hers. Without further explanation, the Duke strode down the aisle with purposeful steps, his formal attire and commanding presence parting the murmuring crowd like the figureheads of his family's ships cleaved ocean waves. Behind him erupted the full chaos his decision had unleashed, the Earl of Harrington bellowing about breach of contract, while his Countess revived sufficiently to declare she would never recover from the humiliation, Lady Sophia herself standing abandoned before the altar, her magnificent gown and Richmond diamonds now symbols of rejection rather than triumph. James neither hesitated nor looked back, his attention fixed solely on the small side door through which Eleanor had departed, oblivious to the scandal exploding in his wake that would dominate London gossip for months to come, uncaring that his actions had just provided the Tun with its most delicious on-dit in a decade. Ladies fanned themselves furiously while exchanging significant glances, gentlemen muttered about duels and satisfaction. The bishop himself appeared on the verge of requiring spiritual intervention, but the Duke of Westmoreland registered none of it as he reached the side door and wrenched it open, admitting a gust of rain-scented air into the incense-perfumed cathedral. In that moment, James Westmoreland, heir to one of England's oldest titles and master of vast estates, cared for nothing but finding the one woman who had always seen beyond his ducal coronet to the man beneath. The rain fell in punishing sheets across the cathedral garden as James burst through the side door, his formal attire immediately drenched as he scanned the sodden landscape with desperate intensity until he spotted a figure among the rose bushes, her once elegant cream gown now translucent and clinging to her trembling form. He moved toward her with single-minded purpose, heedless of the mud that claimed his polished boots or the rain that plastered his golden hair to his forehead. Eleanor turned at the sound of his approach, her tear-streaked face registering first shock, then confusion, then something like terror, as she recognized the man who should at this very moment be completing his wedding vows. "Ellie," he called, using the childhood name no one else had ever been permitted to use, his voice rough with emotion as he confessed that he had been a coward, that he had nearly made the greatest mistake of his life by pledging himself to a woman he could never truly love. Eleanor shook her head in disbelief, rainwater cascading from her loosened chestnut curls as she backed away from him, insisting that he could not possibly be there, that his bride awaited him at the altar, that he must return immediately before the scandal became irreparable. James closed the distance between them with 2 decisive strides, taking her cold hands in his warm ones despite her weak resistance, his blue eyes blazing with a conviction that stopped her protests. He had no bride, he declared fervently, no duchess, no wife but the woman he had loved since they were children racing across Hampshire fields together, the only woman who had ever truly known him, not the title or the fortune, but the man beneath with all his flaws and fears and dreams. Lightning split the sky above them, illuminating Eleanor's face in stark relief, the hope warring with disbelief in her grey eyes, as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he was saying, what he had done. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the cathedral behind them, as though the heavens themselves recognized the momentous nature of this confrontation. Rain continued to pour down upon them, creating a private world within the deluge where only they existed, 2 souls finally acknowledging the truth that had lain between them for years. James still held her hands, his grip tightening as he poured out years of suppressed feelings, confessing that he had tried to do his duty, to be the Duke his family expected, to make the sensible match society demanded, but that watching her walk away during the ceremony had shattered his resolve completely, making him realize that a lifetime of societal approval meant nothing compared to a lifetime without her by his side. The tranquil seclusion of their rain-soaked confession shattered as the cathedral doors burst open, disgorging a flood of wedding guests, who surged into the garden like a wave breaking against the shore. Black umbrellas blooming above gentlemen in formal attire, while ladies gathered their skirts above the muddy ground. At their head strode the Earl of Harrington, Lady Sophia's father, his face contorted with fury as he advanced upon the Duke, bellowing accusations of dishonor and demanding satisfaction at dawn tomorrow, his right as father of the wronged woman requiring blood to cleanse the insult to his house. Behind him came Lady Sophia herself, supported by companions, her magnificent wedding gown now a sodden symbol of rejection, her cold blue eyes fixed on Eleanor with undisguised hatred. The Duchess of Halford, James' aunt, pressed forward to grasp his arm, imploring him to return to the cathedral, insisting that this momentary madness could still be rectified if he would only come to his senses. From the edge of the gathering crowd emerged Lady Blackwood, her expression a mixture of horror and calculation as she pushed through the throng toward her daughter, grasping Eleanor's arm with fingers that dug painfully into her flesh, even through the wet silk of her sleeve, hissing urgently that they must leave immediately, that this madness would destroy them all, that no good could possibly come from being at the center of such a scandal. Eleanor wavered, momentarily overwhelmed by the force of societal judgment pressing in upon them from all sides, the outrage on every face, a stark reminder of the transgression they had committed against the rigid code that governed their world. Yet before she could respond to her mother's desperate plea, James stepped forward, placing himself bodily between Eleanor and the advancing crowd, his commanding presence halting their progress despite the rain that continued to pour down upon the extraordinary tableau. In ringing tones that carried across the garden and silenced even the Earl of Harrington's threats, the Duke of Westmoreland addressed the astonished wedding guests, declaring that he would gladly meet the Earl at dawn if honor demanded it, but that he would no longer sacrifice true happiness for the sake of duty and expectation. With water streaming down his aristocratic features, he announced that he loved Lady Eleanor Blackwood, had loved her since childhood, and intended to make her his duchess if she would have him, regardless of fortune or scandal or societal disapproval. A collective gasp rose from the assembled aristocracy at this unprecedented declaration. Lady Sophia collapsed into her companion's arms, and the Countess of Harrington loudly proclaimed that she would never recover from the disgrace. The battle lines were clearly drawn as James turned back to Eleanor, his expression both resolute and questioning, for while he had just laid waste to convention and destroyed his carefully cultivated reputation, the choice of whether to accept the consequences of their love now rested entirely in her trembling hands. With a protective arm around Eleanor's waist, James guided her through the stunned crowd toward the ducal carriage waiting beyond the cathedral gates, ignoring the continued protests of his relatives and the scandalized whispers that followed their progress. The magnificent vehicle with the Westmoreland crest emblazoned on its gleaming black doors stood ready, the matched greys stamping impatiently as rainwater cascaded from the carriage roof. James handed Eleanor inside before climbing in after her, instructing his driver to take them to Oakridge Lodge with all possible speed, the small hunting property that sat on the outskirts of London, where he occasionally retreated from ducal responsibilities. As the carriage lurched forward, Eleanor sat trembling in her sodden gown, torn between incomprehensible joy at James' declaration and absolute horror at the spectacle they had created, the ruined wedding, the humiliated bride, her mother's stricken face as they departed. The magnitude of what had occurred struck her with physical force as she watched raindrops race down the carriage windows, imagining the furious gossip already spreading through London drawing rooms, the social exile that surely awaited them both, the potential duel that might claim James' life before they could even begin whatever future he envisioned. Seeing her distress, James moved to sit beside her, taking her cold hands in his warm ones, his voice gentle as he explained that he had agreed to marry Sophia primarily to fulfill a promise to his father, who in his final days had extracted a vow that James would secure the succession with a suitable match. The old Duke had specifically mentioned the Pembroke girl, whose dowry would restore certain estates that had fallen into disrepair and whose youth promised many heirs for the Westmoreland line. James had given his word, believing that duty required the sacrifice of personal happiness, convincing himself that contentment might eventually grow from mutual respect if not from love. But standing at the altar, seeing Eleanor's empty seat, he had finally understood the magnitude of his error, recognizing that no sense of obligation could justify binding himself forever to one woman while loving another. The carriage eventually turned onto a narrow lane bordered by ancient oaks, approaching a modest stone structure nestled among the trees, far humbler than the grand Westmoreland Hall, yet possessing a sturdy charm that spoke of refuge and simplicity. Inside, a small staff maintained the hunting lodge in constant readiness for their master's unexpected visits, quickly lighting fires in the hearths and bringing dry clothing, while Eleanor was shown to a comfortable bedchamber to change from her ruined finery. Later, sitting before the blazing fire in the lodge's small parlor, wearing a borrowed dressing gown several sizes too large for her slender frame, Eleanor watched the steam rise from her cup of hot tea and allowed herself to truly believe, for the first time, that the impossible might actually have happened, that the man she had loved in silent resignation for so long had somehow miraculously chosen her above all others. The hunting lodge transformed as evening descended, its modest stone walls now aglow with firelight that danced across polished oak panels and cast long shadows into the corners of the small parlor where Eleanor and James sat side by side on a worn leather settee. Outside, the storm continued its assault, rain lashing against leaded windows while wind howled through ancient oaks, nature itself providing a dramatic backdrop to the extraordinary events of the day. Within this sheltered space, time seemed suspended as they sat in companionable silence, the crackling hearth and occasional rumble of distant thunder, the only sounds breaking the stillness between them. Eleanor gazed into the flames, gathering courage before finally confessing the truth she had guarded for so long, that she had loved him for years, since that summer, when he returned from Oxford, no longer a boy, but a man whose smile could illuminate her darkest moments. Her voice trembled slightly, as she admitted how she had believed herself unworthy after her family lost their fortune, convinced that her advanced age and diminished circumstances rendered her unsuitable for the Duke of Westmoreland, despite their lifelong connection. James listened with growing wonder, his hand finding hers atop the faded velvet cushion between them, his fingers entwining with hers as he revealed his own carefully guarded secret, that his feelings for her had evolved from childhood friendship to something deeper and more profound years ago. He had convinced himself that Eleanor saw him only as a friend, a confidant, perhaps even a brother, never daring to hope she might return the love that had grown in his heart with each passing season. The firelight caught the gleam of moisture in his eyes as he described how he had tried to resign himself to duty, to the match his father had arranged, believing that sacrificing his own happiness was simply the price of his position. Moving closer, he raised her hand to his lips, his voice fervent as he vowed he would rather face society's scorn with her than endure a lifetime of emptiness without her, that no duchy, no fortune, no ancestral legacy could possibly compensate for the absence of true connection. Eleanor trembled at his words, still scarcely able to believe that the impossible had somehow transformed into reality, that the man she had loved in silence for so long had chosen her above all considerations of duty and expectation. As the storm reached its crescendo outside, howling like the scandalized voices of London society they had defied, James leaned forward to press his forehead gently against hers, creating a moment of perfect stillness at the center of the turbulence that surrounded them. In that intimate connection, unspoken promises passed between them, a shared understanding that whatever challenges awaited beyond the shelter of this refuge, they would face them together, their bond forged through years of friendship, now strengthened by honestly acknowledged love. Dawn broke over the hunting lodge, with tentative golden fingers of light pushing through the storm clouds that had exhausted themselves overnight, revealing a landscape washed clean, but bearing the evidence of nature's fury in fallen branches and scattered leaves. Eleanor descended the narrow staircase in borrowed clothing, her own gown still damp from yesterday's deluge, to find James already dressed and standing before the parlor window, his broad shoulders tense beneath his informal morning coat. Their shared breakfast was a quiet affair, filled with gentle glances and the occasional brush of fingers, both still adjusting to the astonishing transformation in their circumstances, until the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered their peaceful interlude. The Duke of Halford, James' paternal uncle and effective head of the family since the old Duke's passing, burst into the lodge without ceremony, his aristocratic features rigid with barely contained fury as he confronted his nephew. The elder man wasted no time on pleasantries, announcing in clipped tones that he came bearing the unanimous decision of the Westmoreland Family Council, an ultimatum delivered with cold precision that sent a chill through Eleanor's heart, even as she listened from the partially open door of the adjoining room. James would return to London immediately, offer a public apology to Lady Sophia and her family, claiming temporary madness brought on by wedding nerves, and proceed with the marriage as planned, or face complete disownment, not merely financial but total excision from family connections and social circles. Eleanor pressed trembling fingers to her lips as the full implications became clear. The devastating consequences James would face, should he persist in choosing her over duty. Her practical mind raced ahead to the reality that would follow: the loss of his ancestral homes, his position in society, the fortune that had shaped his entire existence, all sacrificed for a woman's love. Moving into the parlor with quiet dignity, Eleanor addressed both men with calm resolve despite the pain lancing through her heart, insisting that she could not allow James to lose everything for her sake, that the price was too high, that she would return to her mother's house immediately and never see him again, if that would protect him from such a fate. James turned to her with an expression she had never witnessed before, a blend of tenderness and implacable determination that transformed his features from aristocratic reserve to fierce passion. Addressing his uncle without breaking his gaze from Eleanor's face, he declared that he had lived as they all dictated for years, sacrificing his own happiness for family expectations, but that he would do so no more. His voice gained strength as he continued, stating that if the price of loving Eleanor was the loss of everything else he possessed, he considered it a bargain gladly struck, and that his uncle could convey to the family council that the Duke of Westmoreland chose love over legacy, heart over heritage, and would never regret the decision, even if they followed through on every threatened consequence. The heated exchange between James and his uncle provided Eleanor with the opportunity she needed, slipping quietly from the parlor while their attention remained fixed on their increasingly acrimonious debate, the older man's threats rising in volume as James refused to yield. In the small writing desk in her borrowed bedchamber, Eleanor found paper and pen, her fingers trembling as she composed what must be her final communication with the man she loved, explaining through tear-spotted ink that she could not and would not be responsible for his complete ruination, that while love might sustain their hearts, it could not provide the material necessities of life to which he was accustomed, and that someday he would thank her for having the strength to end things before he sacrificed everything for a momentary passion. She sealed the note with a drop of wax, placing it prominently on the pillow where he would be certain to find it, before slipping down the servants' staircase and out through the kitchen garden, flagging down a passing farmer's cart to convey her to the main road, where she might find more suitable transportation back to London. The journey passed in a blur of grief, Eleanor's practical mind already constructing the fortress of resignation she would need to inhabit for the remainder of her days, knowing that this time there could be no hope of James someday turning to her, that she had experienced both the greatest joy and deepest sorrow possible in the span of a single day. The Blackwood townhouse loomed before her like a prison as she finally arrived. Her mother's shocked expression at her disheveled appearance in borrowed clothing quickly transforming to cold fury as the story emerged through halting explanation. Lady Blackwood paced the modest drawing room like a caged tigress, her voice rising with each enumeration of the catastrophic consequences Eleanor's actions would have on their already precarious social standing, culminating in the devastating accusation that her eldest daughter had destroyed what little standing they had left, ensuring they would be excluded from every respectable drawing room in London once news of her involvement in the Westmoreland wedding scandal became common knowledge. Eleanor accepted her mother's condemnation with quiet dignity, knowing she deserved far worse for allowing matters to proceed to such a point, for not having the strength to resist James' declaration in the cathedral garden, for the momentary weakness of believing happiness might be possible despite all the barriers that stood between them. As she climbed the stairs to her bedchamber, exhaustion claiming every limb, Eleanor acknowledged that her sacrifice had been necessary, that James would eventually see the wisdom of reconciling with his family, and perhaps even with Lady Sophia, that the brief joy they had shared would sustain her through the lonely years ahead, never suspecting that even as she closed her bedroom door, the Duke of Westmoreland was discovering her farewell note and mounting his fastest horse, his expression set with the determination of a man who had no intention of accepting her noble sacrifice. A week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and hollow days, during which Eleanor barely left her bedchamber except when summoned by her mother to receive visitors, society ladies whose concern thinly veiled their ravenous appetite for scandal. Lady Millicent Fairchild arrived first, with eyes bright behind her practiced expression of sympathy, relishing each detail she could extract about that dreadful scene in the cathedral garden, followed by Countess Spencer, who lamented how the Duke of Westmoreland had become virtually unwelcome at gentlemen's clubs throughout London, his closest friends abandoning him like rats from a sinking ship. Mrs. Harrington, cousin to Lady Sophia, made a point of informing Eleanor that the Pembrokes were consulting solicitors about legal action for breach of promise, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, as she suggested the damages might be ruinous even for a fortune as substantial as the Duke's. Each visitor departed with fresh morsels to distribute throughout London drawing rooms, leaving Eleanor feeling increasingly hollowed out, a public spectacle rather than a woman of flesh and blood. The servants whispered behind closed doors, falling silent whenever she appeared, while her younger sister Charlotte avoided her entirely, concerned that association with Eleanor's disgrace might tarnish her own prospects for the upcoming season. Her mother maintained a frigid silence broken only to relay new developments in their social exile, invitations withdrawn, acquaintances suddenly indisposed when the Blackwood carriage appeared at their doors. Even their modiste sent word that she could no longer accommodate Lady Blackwood's patronage, citing an unexpectedly full schedule, a transparent excuse that fooled no one. Through these torturous visits, Eleanor gleaned fragments of James' fate, learning that the Duke of Halford had publicly disavowed his nephew's actions and withdrawn the family's support, that the Earl of Harrington had indeed issued a challenge, though cooler heads had thus far prevented an actual duel, that James had been seen riding alone through Hyde Park at unfashionable hours, shunned by former companions. Each report pierced her heart with fresh pain, confirming that her decision to leave had been correct, that had she remained, she would have witnessed the complete destruction of the man she loved, his position, his reputation, his very identity as Duke of Westmoreland, stripped away because of his momentary madness in choosing her. Despite the agony of separation, despite knowing she would never see him again, Eleanor clung to the cold comfort that her sacrifice had given James the opportunity to reconcile with his family and eventually with society, even as she herself accepted that her own place in the world she had known was irrevocably lost, her reputation beyond salvage, her future a bleak landscape of isolation and whispers that would follow her to the grave. The afternoon bell announced a visitor, just as Eleanor was contemplating yet another meal excused due to headache, the prospect of facing her mother's recriminations across the dining table having robbed her of appetite for days. She expected another vulture in ladies' clothing come to extract fresh details of her disgrace, but instead found herself summoned to the drawing-room to receive the Dowager Duchess of Westmoreland herself, an imperious figure in black silk, whose mere presence seemed to command the modest chamber to expand to accommodate her dignity. The elderly woman's silver hair was arranged beneath a severe bonnet adorned with jet beads, her spine ramrod straight despite her 70 years, her piercing blue eyes so reminiscent of James that Eleanor felt physical pain at the resemblance. Lady Blackwood hovered nearby, visibly torn between pride that such an exalted personage had crossed their threshold and terror that this visit signaled some new catastrophe about to befall them. The Dowager wasted no time on pleasantries, dismissing Lady Blackwood with a regal wave before fixing Eleanor, with a penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away all pretense, all social artifice, leaving her feeling utterly exposed before this formidable woman. "So," declared the Duchess in tones that suggested she was accustomed to immediate compliance, "you're the woman brave enough to save my grandson from a loveless marriage." The unexpected assessment momentarily robbed Eleanor of speech, her carefully prepared apologies dying unspoken on her lips as the Dowager continued, her aristocratic accent crisp as she informed Eleanor that James had been searching for her since discovering her note, that he had refused all attempts at reconciliation with either his family or the Pembrokes, and that the foolish boy was proving remarkably stubborn about the whole affair. Eleanor managed to stammer that she had only sought to prevent his complete ruination, to which the dowager responded with a short bark of laughter entirely at odds with her dignified appearance, informing her young companion that the Westmorlands had weathered far worse scandals than a broken engagement, including her own marriage 60 years prior. With surprising frankness, the elderly woman revealed that she herself had married the 5th Duke for love against her family's wishes, choosing a second son with uncertain prospects over the wealthy Marquess selected by her parents, and that despite the scandal that had ensued, despite being temporarily cast out from society, she had never for a single moment regretted following her heart. The years of happiness she had shared with her Harry had been worth every whisper, every closed door, every cutting remark, she declared, and she would be damned if she allowed her grandson to sacrifice his chance at similar joy because of some milksop girl chosen for her dowry and bloodlines rather than her character. Rising with remarkable grace for a woman of her years, the dowager announced her intention to sponsor Eleanor, to welcome her publicly into the Westmoreland family, regardless of what the rest might say, and to host a small dinner party the following week, where James and Eleanor could meet again without interference, her tone making it abundantly clear that she expected no argument from anyone, least of all the young woman who had somehow captured her grandson's heart. The Dowager Duchess had departed less than an hour prior, leaving Eleanor in a state of bewildered hope, when the sound of raised voices in the entrance hall drew her attention from the letter she had been composing to her aunt in Bath. She recognized her brother's furious tones immediately, followed by another voice that sent her heart racing despite her best intentions, a voice she had resigned herself to never hearing again. Moving swiftly to the landing, she peered down to see James Westmoreland himself standing in the foyer, rain darkening his greatcoat as her brother Charles attempted to physically block his path up the staircase, insisting that no member of the Westmoreland family was welcome in their home after the disgrace visited upon them. James appeared utterly unmoved by this hostility, his voice level but firm as he informed Charles Blackwood that he would see Eleanor regardless of obstacle, that he had respected her wishes by giving her a week of solitude, but would wait no longer, and that Charles was welcome to summon the authorities if he wished, but should be prepared for the additional scandal such action would generate. Eleanor descended the stairs with as much composure as her trembling limbs allowed, instructing her brother with gentle authority that she would receive his grace in the drawing-room, her decision apparently final, despite Charles' continued protests about family loyalty and female vulnerability. Once alone with James, the carefully constructed walls of Eleanor's resolve began to crumble at the sight of him standing before the modest hearth, his tall frame somehow making the familiar room seem smaller, his blue eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. Without preamble, James crossed the space between them in 3 decisive strides, then astonished her completely by lowering himself to one knee before her, taking her cold hand in his warm one as he produced a small velvet box from his waistcoat pocket. Inside, nestled a ring of exceptional beauty, an emerald surrounded by diamonds in an antique setting that Eleanor instantly recognized as belonging to the Dowager Duchess herself, the very woman who had departed her house so recently. James spoke without hesitation, his voice steady as he declared that he should have done this years ago, that he had wasted precious time trying to be the Duke everyone expected rather than the man his heart urged him to be, that he had searched for her since discovering her note, refusing to accept her sacrifice, regardless of how nobly intended. He dismissed the concerns that had prompted her departure, informing her that his grandmother had pledged her support, that his fortune was primarily his own rather than entailed with the title, and most importantly, that he cared nothing for society's opinion, compared to the prospect of a lifetime without her. The proposal hung between them, heartfelt and unambiguous, as Eleanor stood momentarily frozen by the magnitude of the choice before her, knowing that accepting would mean facing continued scandal, yet unable to deny the love that had sustained her through years of silent longing, now offered openly by the only man who had ever held her heart. The Dowager Duchess of Westmoreland transformed her London residence into a spectacle of magnificence for the first grand ball of the autumn season. Crystal chandeliers ablaze with hundreds of candles, illuminating reception rooms decorated with hothouse blooms and staffed by footmen in full livery. Society had buzzed for weeks about the unprecedented invitation that named Lady Eleanor Blackwood and the Duke of Westmoreland as honoured guests of the formidable dowager, forcing London's elite to choose between snubbing one of the most powerful women in England or tacitly accepting the couple whose scandal had dominated drawing-room conversation throughout the summer. Eleanor entered the grand ballroom on James' arm, her gown of deep sapphire silk complementing the Westmoreland emeralds that now adorned her throat and wrists, tangible symbols of the dowager's approval. The initial hush that greeted their appearance gradually gave way to murmurs of curiosity as the elderly Duchess personally led Eleanor through the receiving line, introducing her with pointed emphasis as my grandson's betrothed to each arriving guest, her arctic glare silencing any who might have contemplated refusing the younger woman's hand. James remained constantly at Eleanor's side, his hand protectively at the small of her back as they navigated the complex social currents, responding to cool nods with perfect courtesy and to genuine warmth with evident gratitude. The truly astonishing moment arrived midway through the evening, when Lady Sophia Pembroke herself appeared on the arm of Lord Branwell, son of the Duke of Sutherland, a diamond ring prominently displayed on her gloved hand, announcing their engagement merely 6 weeks after her public humiliation. The two women inevitably found themselves face to face beside the refreshment table, a moment of tension that rippled through nearby observers like wind across a wheat field. Eleanor spoke first, her voice carrying just far enough for those closest to hear as she wished Lady Sophia sincere happiness, expressing hope that she might find the joy that comes from true connection rather than mere advantageous alliance. Lady Sophia's expression betrayed momentary confusion before settling into practiced social pleasantry, her response gracious if somewhat brittle, as she accepted the good wishes with a nod, before allowing Lord Branwell to lead her toward the dance floor. By the time the orchestra struck up the final waltz of the evening, a subtle but significant transformation had occurred within the ballroom, the initial frost having thawed into something approaching normal social interaction as influential matrons who followed the dowagers lead beckoned Eleanor into their circles, and gentlemen who respected James beyond his title engaged him in conversation about parliamentary matters rather than the scandal. As James guided Eleanor through the elegant steps of the waltz, her heart light with cautious hope, she understood that while some doors might remain forever closed to them, many others were beginning to open, society gradually accepting what they could not change, their path forward, not without obstacles, but increasingly navigable thanks to the unexpected ally who now watched them with evident satisfaction from her throne-like chair at the head of the ballroom. The wedding of the Duke of Westmoreland and Lady Eleanor Blackwood took place as dawn broke over Westmore Hall, the Dowager Duchess country estate in Hampshire, not 5 miles from the meadows where they had played as children. No grand cathedral with hundreds of aristocratic witnesses, no elaborate decorations or formal processions, only the ancient stone chapel on the estate grounds, illuminated by the first golden rays of morning light, filtering through stained glass windows that had witnessed Westmoreland weddings for generations. Roses from the ducal gardens adorned the small space, their fragrance mingling with beeswax candles as the intimate gathering of true friends and loyal allies took their places in the oak pews, a stark contrast to the society spectacle that had ended in scandal months before. The Dowager Duchess presided like a benevolent monarch from the front pew, her regal bearing softened by evident satisfaction as she watched her grandson stand before the altar, waiting for his bride. Eleanor appeared in the doorway on her brother's arm, Charles Blackwood having finally reconciled himself to the match after witnessing the depths of his sister's happiness, her gown of ivory silk far simpler than Lady Sophia's had been, yet somehow more radiant against her glowing skin. No Richmond diamonds adorned her throat, only a single strand of Westmoreland pearls, a gift from the Dowager that morning, and symbol of her complete acceptance into the family. The ceremony proceeded with none of the stiff formality that had characterized the aborted cathedral wedding, the ancient words spoken with genuine emotion rather than practiced precision. Vows exchanged, not as social contracts, but as heartfelt promises between two people who had overcome extraordinary obstacles to stand together. When James spoke his personal vow, his voice carried throughout the small chapel with unwavering certainty as he acknowledged that he had nearly lost her to fear and convention, that he had almost sacrificed true happiness for the sake of duty and expectation, but that he would spend every day of his life ensuring she never doubted his love again. Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes as she responded with her own promise to stand beside him through whatever challenges might come, to face society's judgment together rather than apart, to cherish the connection they had nurtured since childhood, above all worldly considerations. As the morning sun rose fully above the horizon, bathing the chapel in multicolored light through the ancient stained glass, the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, a declaration met with genuine joy from the small gathering rather than the polite approval that would have greeted a more conventional match. Hand in hand, the new Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland processed down the short aisle and out into the golden morning, where the Hampshire countryside stretched before them, the landscape of their shared childhood, now the setting for their shared future, their triumph over societal expectations, complete as they chose authentic love over prescribed duty, genuine connection over advantageous alliance. Spring painted Westmore Hall in vibrant colors, the formal gardens surrounding the ancient manor house, erupting in a profusion of blossoms, as though nature itself celebrated the triumph of love over convention that had unfolded within these grounds. 1 year after their dawn wedding in the estate chapel, the Duke and Duchess of Westmoreland hosted an intimate gathering of the friends and family who had stood firmly beside them through scandal and uncertainty, their loyalty now rewarded with the warm hospitality of a couple whose happiness radiated from every glance, every touch, every shared smile. Society had gradually accepted what it could not change. The scandal fading as newer, more shocking ondits claimed the attention of drawing-room gossips. Invitations to the most prestigious events once again arriving at Westmore Hall, though the Duke and Duchess selected carefully which they would honor with their presence. Eleanor moved among their guests with serene grace, her simple gown of spring green silk complementing the glow of impending motherhood, one hand often resting protectively on the gentle swell of her abdomen, where the Westmoreland air grew stronger each day. The Dowager Duchess observed from her favorite garden bench with evident satisfaction, receiving the congratulations of guests who acknowledged her foresight in supporting the match that had scandalized London but now produced the continuation of the family line. As twilight descended on the gathering, casting long shadows across the lawn where they had played as children, James guided Eleanor to the small rose garden that had been her favorite retreat since taking residence at Westmore Hall. Among the blooming flowers whose fragrance perfumed the evening air, he drew her into his arms, his expression tender as he placed his hand beside hers over their unborn child. In quiet tones meant for her ears alone, he confessed that he thanked God every day for the rain that had washed away his blindness that day at the cathedral, the storm that had revealed what truly mattered beyond duty and expectation. Eleanor leaned against his solid strength, reflecting with wonder on how the moment of her greatest pain, sobbing in the rain outside his wedding, had ultimately led to her greatest joy, as though the universe had required that crucible of suffering to forge the happiness they now shared. From their position in the rose garden, they could see their gathered friends raising glasses in toast on the terrace, loyal allies who had weathered the storm alongside them, while beyond the estate boundaries lay the society that had nearly destroyed them but now grudgingly accepted their union. The setting sun cast a golden glow over Westmore Hall as James bent to kiss his wife, the Duke and Duchess standing together amid blooming roses, their defiance of convention vindicated by the depth of their connection and the new life that would soon join them, final proof that true love could indeed triumph over the rigid expectations of their world.